Hello. The head of the United Nations Emergency Relief Operations, Martin Griffiths, says the international community has failed people of northwest Syria, where thousands have died in the earthquakes that struck. The number of people confirmed to have died after the devastating earthquakes 6 days ago has now risen above 28,000 altogether. Meanwhile, prosecutors investigating standards of building construction in Turkey have now issued more than 100 arrest warrants in the aftermath of the disaster. Well, for the very latest on the ground, we can join my colleague Lise Doucette. Lise, just give us the picture where you are and what is happening there right now.
Well, what you see behind us here in Gaziantep, about an hour-and-a-half drive from the epicenter where that earthquake struck about nearly 1 week ago, is being played out in towns and cities across a whole swathe of southern Turkey and indeed across the border in northern Syria. And that is the diggers they don't have diggers across the border, but diggers here and excavators are getting rid of these mounds of rubble. It is a sign that the rescue effort, those painstaking, almost heroic efforts to try to pull people alive from the rubble, and still nearly a week on, they're still finding people. But the effort, the focus is now shifting to recovery, to relief, and also to a reckoning, as you mentioned, those more than 100 arrest warrants for the builders who are being blamed for this staggering death toll.
Yeah, so there are recriminations now about builders, architects and so on, also about the government and the slowness of the disaster response, particularly from the military.
Yes, everywhere we went, there has been anger mixed with grief, and those very raw emotions have boiled over whenever we've asked someone about, well, this was an earthquake, the most powerful earthquake in Turkey's history, but is there anything else you blame? And people do talk about a lack of a plan. They talk about the fact that the building code was not respected. And there's been these jarring scenes where we sometimes go to one neighborhood and one side of the street is still standing and the other side completely collapsed, underlining that the buildings were built with different materials and different construction. And even behind me, you see some of the buildings collapse, but even those still standing are still too dangerous to inhabit. They have these long, deep cracks, which means they will someday fall to the ground.
And this is something that Turkey really has to address, because earthquakes, they're quite frequent in Turkey. I mean, not on this scale, but there was another one, a huge one back in 1999 that killed nearly 20,000 people. And it sits on huge fault lines, so there will be more earthquakes in the future.
Yes, there's more than one fault line in Turkey. There's been 4 earthquakes in recent decades. This is the most powerful one. President Erdogan is calling it the disaster of the century. This one was on what's called the East Anatolian fault line, and the earthquake itself was very shallow. There were, in fact, 2 earthquakes one day after the other, and that accounts for the fact that such a large swathe was struck when the earth shook this time. President Erdogan is coming under pressure, though. He's about to face the electorate in May if those elections go ahead on time, and he is pushing back against the criticism, saying, don't play politics, this was destiny's fate, we couldn't have prepared for this kind of a catastrophe. And this turning of attention toward the builders is both a reckoning, and he has to find those who are partly responsible, but it also helps him to shift the blame away from him as a focus of people's anger to the builders, who are, as always in these kind of disasters, they have to partly are being held somewhat responsible.
OK, Lise, thank you very much indeed. Lise Doucette there in Gaziantep. Well, our correspondent Tom Bateman is near the city of Antakya. That's in Hatay province, in the southernmost province of Turkey, and he sent us this report.
We're on the road here outside the city of Antakya in Hatay, and Antakya is devastated, one of the worst affected areas. what's happening here is people that have managed to escape the city are stopping here. This has become a staging post. You can see this way there are some tents, not many. These are the official Turkish aid agency tents. And then there's supplies that have been turning up. But one of the big things that's happening here are the buses. So you can see mini buses here, other buses behind them. And if you come down this way, we'll walk this way. There are some Turkish troops that have been directing people. But what we've just been finding as we've spoken to people is that they are desperate. These are people whose homes have been either completely destroyed or they can't live in. So they've been in Antakya for nearly a week now since the earthquake. People told us horrendous stories of for 3 days, no help arriving, being able to hear and be aware of people still alive in buildings before any rescue work arrived. So now these people are managing to get out. You can see more buses here, but people are exhausted and shocked. We've just seen quite a bit of frustration and tension. Some are getting angry about that he couldn't get on a bus, and another woman wanted to get to Antalya and was told the minibus would come back for her, that she couldn't get on. She didn't believe them. So people are incredibly frustrated. There is some anger. They desperately need help. So this is some of the support that's being provided by the state, but you can just feel how it's spread so thin. And this is before we even got into Antakya itself. These are the ones that are managing to get out.
Tom Bateman reporting there. And let's take a look at the situation in Syria as well. It's almost a week since the earthquake. And let's just take a look at these pictures this morning. This was where a little girl was rescued, bringing hope amidst the despair, and she's been pulled out through a hole in the floor of a building. This is actually in Turkey, in the southeastern Turkish province of Hatay, where we were just hearing from Tom Bateman. Rescuers, we can see here, said the girl is called Kudi and that she had been buried for 147 hours, extraordinary length of time. And we've actually just also received these pictures of her father and daughter being rescued, again in Hatay province in Turkey. If you look closely, you can see she's lying on the top of her father there. That is the pink of her coat. So some extraordinary tales of survival, as there always are after earthquakes. But overwhelmingly, the picture, I'm afraid, is of massive destruction and widespread death. As I say, we're going to look at the picture in Syria now, where Ubada Sa'alwan, spokesman for the Syrian Civil Defence, the volunteer group also known as the White Helmets, has been telling us that in Syria they haven't rescued anybody from the rubble since Thursday, and they need more help from the outside world and especially the UN.
Our volunteers on the ground are spread very thin. The catastrophe has definitely put us way over our capacity. We're dealing with a population of 4 million people after this huge catastrophic situation. And our organization's approximately 3,000 people on the ground. I mean, it's just way too much for one kind of organization to handle. Disappointment and abandonment is definitely a general feeling that's happening. I mean, we're 7 days into the earthquake. Our organization has been calling for help, for manpower, for rescue equipment. And the first couple of days, we were just ignored and we're left to deal with this situation on our own. Our machines were breaking down. Volunteers were digging people out with their own hands. The catastrophe at this scale could have definitely been avoided if we had some help earlier on. I mean, why hasn't aid been able to be brought in? We believe that there are policies in place to respond to a catastrophe at this level, and we believe that politics or anything aside should be put aside in order to properly respond to such a devastating circumstance.